Thank you very much for these very kind words. The honor is completely mine. It's a pleasure to take you after so many inspiring papers. I'm profiting of this virtual seminar to take you all across the North Sea, indeed to the Low Countries, to the region which likes to identify itself as a sort of living lab in the relationship with the sea. And in 2019, the engineers of Deltares, and Deltares, that's the Water Institute of the Netherlands, they questioned the issue of sea level rise, and they saw 4 fundamental solutions to what is waiting for us in the 21st century. They saw 4 scenarios. In the first scenario, we will build ever higher sea and river walls, more or less at the present locations, while in scenario B and C, we will shield our coasts by a new type of flood barrier, either following the present-day coastline, scenario B, or further seawards, creating an entirely new territory and many new opportunities. But small problem, if we will do so, we will need nuclear power probably to evacuate the river water to the sea. And there is an even bigger elephant in the room, because the 4th scenario, which on first sight is the most logic, is that we relocate all these low-lying settlements and populations to higher grounds, and that we only perhaps leave the major cities like Rotterdam and Amsterdam as islands in the water. At first sight, this last solution, the idea of coastal retreat, coastal realignment, it goes against the national identity of the people in the Netherlands, because God created the world, but on the last day, the Dutch created their own land. We will never give in to the sea. And yet, there have been precedents. In the Scheldt area alone, there are more than 100 villages, as far as we know, which have been abandoned to the water between the 14th and the 16th centuries. And more to the north, in Holland, Frisia, the Waddenzee area, there are hundreds more. Their demise is neither the result of sea level rise. The theory of late medieval sea transgressions has long been abandoned, nor of climate change, and I will come back on that, because it's less evident. But rather they are the result of mostly endogenous environmental and social factors. On these flooded villages, there is a clear shift in the historical and archaeological narrative, which is directly related to present-day debates on coastal retreat. The older narrative was the disaster narrative, which originated, in fact, in the early modern period. The ruins of abandoned churches and castles constantly reminded the inhabitants of the coastal areas of the dangers of the sea. Mind the next floods. The floods were, of course, acts of God. Apocalyptic terror punishing the inhabitants for their sin. What was left was a desert, a wasteland, total destruction. And there were legends of church bells still ringing at night, lost souls dwelling around these ruins everywhere in the flooded landscape. Well, the first generation of modern investigations of flooded villages still echoed this disaster narrative. In Belgium, the classic study, the pioneering study, was the village of Nieuw Roeselare. It was already in the 1960s, the Ghent historian Adriaan Verhulst, who was a corresponding member of the Deserted Medieval Village Research Group, and his Dutch colleague Elisabeth Godschalk, who singled out this village, which was flooded in 1375 and which was hidden underneath the sand and the clay of early modern depositions, as a unique opportunity for medieval settlement archaeology. In the 1970s, the village was located and studied in 3 campaigns, but excavations concentrated on the church and the larger manor house, and they were not really able to improve our insight in the flood event itself, because they could only confirm what Verhulst and Godschalk already said, that it was triggered by a storm surge, of course, but that it was probably also caused by the fundamental impoverishment of the population in the wake of the late medieval crisis. Over the past decades, however, archaeology evolved in completely different directions, producing spectacular new results and also new interpretations. In the case of Nieuw Roeselare, Gerben Verbrugge from Ghent University recently combined fieldwalking, historical maps, aerial photography, digital elevation models, and electromagnetic induction, and he managed to do what his predecessors had not been able to, reconstructing not only the morphology of the flooded village, which was a planted row settlement from the 13th century, but also showing how a tidal channel has settled in the main road of the village after 1375, thereby gradually eroding the village center. Moreover, Verbrugge was also able to locate the new seawall, which was built already in the decades following the inundation, and behind which a new village was built before the end of the century. The new archaeology of deserted villages quite naturally provided an environmental understanding of settlement dynamics, in which humans mainly reacted to changing environmental conditions. Another example, more to the north, Venehuizen in the South Sea area in Frisia. In 2020, the Groninger archaeologists Eftinus van Popta investigated this Frisian village, which literally means Venehuizen, peat houses, in the South Sea. In the 12th and 13th century, massive floods had breached the remaining peat barrier between North Holland and Frisia, and Venehuizen was mentioned first in the 13th century, a village in the peat, and it was also probably abandoned in 1375. And also, like Nieuw Roeselare, around 1400, there was a new settlement, the second Venehuizen, which in the 16th century was abandoned for a third settlement, the third Venehuizen. Van Popta concludes the existence of the Zuiderzee, the South Sea, has influenced the life of people who inhabited the peatlands on which Venehuizen was founded. Storm surges and tidal activity constantly threatened the small and vulnerable settlements, leaving their inhabitants no other option than to move further inland. This was no country for man. Final archaeological example is the site of Raverzijde, is a fishing settlement west of Ostend in Belgium, and now an archaeological museum. The old Raverzijde was abandoned in the same period after 1394 and relocated behind the new seawall. And until the 1990s, you could still see the oldest settlements, which sometimes resurfaced on the beach at very low tide. This old settlement was fishing and partly agrarian settlement. The new one, which you see on the reconstructions, was much denser and was probably more of a full-time fishing village with no courtyards or gardens around the houses. This settlement in turn declined in the 16th century because of new sand drifts, because of warfare, but most of all because the fishing industry went to a phase of consolidation and only the largest ports survived. What emerges from all these case studies is an idea of resilience, active and flexible adaptation to changing environmental conditions. And this also fits the broader literature on deserted villages elsewhere. In their review of medieval settlement research, published in 2020, Steve Rippon and Benjamin Morton highlight two major insights which have come out of recent archaeological research. One, village desertion is a very gradual phenomenon in most cases. And two, the villagers, and not only the lords, had a lot of agency in the process. But was it that simple? How did you, in the 14th century, move a settlement? Over the years, we've got better in investigating the materiality of relocated villages and the environmental conditions in which the old and new settlements were situated. But what we often ignore, and what I want to discuss in the rest of my presentation, is how this process of flooding and relocation actually worked. How did you relocate a village or even a small town in the context of the 14th or 15th century? When and why was relocation an option? And how did people do this actually? And I want to take you to the city of Ostend. Ostend, literally the east end of a former coastal island in front of the Flemish coast, the island Testerep. Old Ostend was a 13th century planned settlement which received town privileges in 1267. We should imagine in the 13th century a partly fishing settlement, but partly agrarian settlement, as the old town charter pays a lot of attention to the animals of the town people, who should be obstructed entering the dunes belonging to the Count of Flanders. The town was carved out of the Count's domain in the dunelands, and everyone who wanted to could construct a house on a rectangular, quite large plot of about 300 square meters against the payment of a fixed hereditary rent to the Count. With a market hall and a settlement, a separate bench of aldermen, this was a proper town, but we should not exaggerate the differences with many other settlements of peasant fishermen found all over the Flemish coast, and you see them here every year going to the Humber estuary in the custom accounts of Scarborough and Ravensir. 60 years after the town charter, the storm surge of 1334, the so-called Clemens flood, hit the town and started to erode part of its territory. In the next years, the church had to be relocated to the more inland part of the settlement, still in the dunes. But this was not the end of the story. Exactly 60 years later, most of the town was flooded again, and its protection against further erosion now seemed impossible. Instead of again relocating the church, the people of Ostend decided to relocate the whole settlement. And thanks to a charter issued by Philip, Duke of Burgundy, and his wife Margaret, Countess of Flanders, we have a detailed description on how this last relocation worked out. First of all, what you needed was land to rebuild the town. And this new 15th or late 14th century town was rebuilt behind the dune barriers on former agricultural land, which was private land, privately owned, and, says the Charter of 1395, it was mostly owned by burghers, citizens of Ostend, which had already purchased this land. Coastal Flanders had never seen the development of classic manorialism, which means that peasants enjoyed secure property rights on their land. These lands were traded on a relatively open land market, and so the citizens of Ostend could build their new town on land they had purchased, or some of them had purchased. 20 years ago, archaeological research has revealed some of these new houses in brick, which were indeed constructed on top of former arable land. Most of the arrangements in the Charter of 1395 concern the flood protection. The town dwellers would be protected by a new seawall, which was part of the regional seawall constructed and maintained by the surrounding villages. And Ostend had to maintain its part of this new seawall and contribute in the general costs of drainage. This required immediate collective investment besides the private investment to rebuild houses. Probably to the surprise of the inhabitants, the old 14th century church would still be standing in the late 16th century, but a new one was already built in the early 15th century. Only in the 17th century, the remains of the oldest town of the second town, in fact, would disappear in the waves. Now, what does the story of Ostend tell us about settlement relocation? A few things. First of all, the floods which triggered the relocations are, in my opinion, not a sort of spectacular biblical floods which destroyed everything and everyone. There were storms every winter, and once or twice in a lifetime there were, and there still are, bigger ones. Weather storminess increased in the later Middle Ages in the North Sea area I still have not a clue after 20 years of research. I don't know. What I'm convinced is that they caused relatively few deadly victims. To my best knowledge, there is not a single reliable report on a flood disaster before 1500 which mentions more than a few deadly victims. Why? Because these storms were so frequent, because people living in a coastal area perfectly knew when and how to evacuate to a higher spot in the landscape. Not only the number of victims was probably limited, the amount of destruction also was. In fact, the old town of Ostend did not disappear in the waves. It remained visible for another 2 centuries. It remained even occupied for another 2 centuries. Early modern depictions of flooded landscapes, like this one near Antwerp, they are highly misleading. They are even a sort of discursive constructions in which devastations are explicitly exaggerated in order to evict the former inhabitants, and I will come back on that. Much more accurate in this respect is the altarpiece from Dordrecht, realized shortly before 1500, which brings us to the south of Holland, to the Meuse estuary, which shows the flooding of the Grote Waard, and I already saw it this morning in one of the presentations very briefly. The area hit by the flood of 1421 is the so-called Biesbos today. It's wonderful to visit. And what this altarpiece, realized 70 years later, shows is the water overflowing the seawall. Yes, indeed. And even a few people killed, but yeah, you could see him on the first picture, but it's not very clear. Here is someone in the water. But what it mostly shows is not a giant water mass. There was no giant water mass. It shows the careful evacuation of the area. It was this 1421 Elizabeth flood. We just, it is 6 centuries ago, and hydrologists have calculated how much water would actually have been flooded into this territory, which had 20 villages in total. And they agreed that it could be no more than 60 to 80 centimeters. So that's not, the area must have flooded very gradually, not in weeks, not in months, but over years or even decades, with each tide gradually eroding a bit more of the land and redistributing the settlement. This also means that some of the settlements in this flooded area were still inhabited 20, 30 years later. The castle of one of the villages was repaired in 1436. The Holy Sacrament still kept in the church of another village in 1449. And even 100 years after the flood, commissioners sent out by the Habsburg Emperor Charles V were greatly amazed that so many people were still living in the flooded area, and they were not allowed to do so. They had to abandon this area because it was supposed to be flooded. So what we see here is a gradual process of settlement desertion. Just like the sand inundations David Griffith started with this morning, maritime inundations also were very gradual, which allowed for the careful dismantling of structures and buildings in case of relocations. In many cases, even the foundations of the few stone buildings present, the church notably, were carefully recovered. Stone in the coastal marshes was very costly, so if you had stone, you would take it with you. In the 1430s, the church masters of IJsendijke, a settlement in the Scheldt estuary, which also flooded around 1400, they were suing people which had stolen ornaments and stones from their flooded church. From the lawsuit which followed, it became clear that the church masters were still planning to build a new sanctuary on a different spot. But 30 years after the flood, they had scaled down their ambitions to the size of a chapel. In the meanwhile, they were ordered that they should bring all the stones to a safe spot behind the seawall. But why did these storm surges, recurrent and not that devastating, trigger settlement relocation at all? Here, the environmental conditions do matter a lot. In the case of Ostend, we are dealing with a settlement on a dune barrier. And dune barriers are prone to coastal erosion and sand drifts because of natural process of sediment redisposition, but also interacting with human exploitation of these dune barriers. And for contemporary observers in the 14th century, it's this little animal, the rabbit, which had been introduced on a massive scale in the dunes in the 12th and 13th century, by the Count of Flanders notably. It was these rabbits which were quintessential to understand the increased pace of dune erosion. In peat marshes and on salt marshes, the environmental dynamics of settlement relocation were profoundly different. The peat marshes, which were situated more to the inland of the coastal regions, were the only region where settlement relocation had become a sort of regular, foreseeable element of the settlement process. Peatland reclamation, as it was practiced from the 11th century onwards, was based on the systematic drainage of peat bogs, with settlers gradually moving further into the peat bog, each one along the lines of his own plot. Draining peat for arable means shrinkage and erosion of the top cover, and after a few decades, water problems occurred, and hence the need to relocate. This is an interesting example near Amsterdam, studied by Chris de Bont, the village of Sloten, which is an old village dating from the around the year 1000, but somewhere around 1200, the farmers moved to a new location and strategically chose a sandy hill marsh where the village is still standing today. So that's interesting to see that they were living in the marsh and they relocated to one of these higher places. On the former intertidal salt marshes, the oldest settlements tend to be located on higher spots. These are the famous glacial sand islands we also saw this morning in Caitlin Green's Lincolnshire. It was dry land in a wet environment, which sometimes were spots which were already in use by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. And if they were not available, artificial dwelling mounds were constructures, or natural ones elevated by humans. These are the terpen, wierden and woerten. And you see here a classic example from Groningen in the north of the Netherlands. Many of these terps have been flattened in later times, but a few more or less intact ones surviving show that they would not be easily flooded by a storm surge. Any relocation of such settlement is clearly not triggered by environmental factors. And this brings us to the social drivers of settlement relocation. In the case of Ostend and Raverszijde, relocation was still a bottom-up process. It came from the community of Ostend. It was not organized by a large landowner, a king or bishop, although these could and should sanction them. What mattered is whether the community of inhabitants was still capable of organizing the relocation. And I deliberately introduced the concept of capability here, as defined by Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, notably their capability of environmental control. Are people able to engage with the processes and choices that affect their political and material lives? The inhabitants of Ostend already owned the land on which to construct a new settlement. They also had the capital to build a new seawall, new infrastructure, new houses, new church, or at least they could obtain credit to do so. And this is far from evident. In a world without modern insurance arrangements, the creditworthiness of flood victims was probably limited. Around 1400, house prices in small Flemish cities started from 12 to 15 Flemish pound parisis, the equivalent of about 50 days' work for a skilled craftsman. Perhaps not that much, but how many people in a flooded medieval settlement had so much savings or could obtain credit to construct a new house? Further complicating things, according to Flemish dike law, not being able to pay for dike repair led to expropriation. You were legally obliged to contribute to the investments in flood protection or to abandon your land. If you could not pay for the investment in the maintenance of seawalls, you lost your land. So communities who wished to relocate their village to higher ground faced huge financial challenges, and they needed a certain political leverage to avoid expropriation and eviction. Capability, not only private, but also communal. It required heavy investments in infrastructures. And what we see is that the communities which were able to relocate successfully were also the communities which were investing huge amounts of money in the upkeep of seawalls. Both processes, maintaining existing seawalls, improving them, and relocating if necessary, usually existed together. Relocation was never a cheap alternative for the upkeep of existing flood protection systems. If the local population did not dispose of capital and political leverage, the flooded and abandoned land was often acquired at low prices by outside investors, hoping to make a fortune based on the misfortune of the coastal population. And this is the model which would in the end prevail in coastal Flanders. It's the model of the land grab. What we see now is no longer communities of coastal peasants or agro-fishermen relocating, but merchants from Bruges and state officials reclaiming new polders and building new villages which they claimed were the revival of old flooded settlements. On this 16th century map, and that's my final example, we see some of these revivals. We are here in the Western Scheldt estuary, and we see some of the villages which seemed to be relocations, but they were not. This, for instance, is the third Saint Margriete, the third village of its name, and it was the initiative of a Bruges merchant, Jan de Plaat, in 1462. It's the revival of a 14th century village, but there is no continuity in population between the two settlements. The same here, Saint Catharina. This is an interesting one, Oostmanskerke. It was a relocation of the late 14th century, still by the original inhabitants. But then in the early 16th century, there was a second relocation, which had nothing to do with the original population, but was the initiative of a number of state officials who were naming their new settlement with the name of the old medieval settlement to recover some of the privileges of the former village. Watervliet is the most prestigious of all these new polders, late 15th century, by the Minister of Finance of the Habsburg Archduke Philip de Fer. And this man, Hieronymus Laurein, he claimed that he was reinstating a 14th century town with the same name, and he secured far-reaching fiscal exemptions and even a market for his settlement. A final element which needs to be taken into account when studying the processes of settlement relocation is the changing function of the settlement itself. Medieval coastal villages, whether turf, peat or dune villages, were nucleated settlements because there was a compelling logic to live together in order to work together. This logic by and large disappeared in the coastal wetlands in the 15th century. The new polder landscapes created from the 15th century onwards are the prime example of agrarian individualism. And you see this on this very last example, Callantsoog in the extreme north of Holland. It's a dune settlement and it was relocated at least 3 times. Here we see the second Oog, and here we see the 16th century third Callantsoog. But what matters here is that the settlement is literally dwarfed by the huge new polder created next to it, for which it was practically irrelevant because the new settlement structure was a dispersed settlement. So I'd like to conclude, if you're still following. What do we actually know about the reasons why coastal settlements were relocated or abandoned? In the light of present-day climate change debates, settlement relocation is often celebrated as the ultimate form of resilience, a dynamic adaptation to changing environmental conditions. The people who are told to relocate, they seldom feel resilient, however. In most cases, they feel evicted from their houses, their farms, their lands. Their resilience depends on the capital and the networks they can mobilize to resist eviction or to increase the compensation paid for their expropriation. Relocation is one possible outcome, resulting often from a long and painful negotiation process. This was also the case in the medieval coastal marshes and probably in other periods as well. The most resilient communities were not those who relocated, they were those who never had to relocate because they were not vulnerable to flooding in the first place. And in that sense, the contrast between the oldest, often very stable medieval settlements and the newer, more dynamic ones of the 11th, 12th and 13th century is remarkable. More settlements had to be relocated in the later Middle Ages because human land use had gradually become more aggressive, more risk-taking. In some cases, the inhabitants were capable of actively organizing a new life on a safer spot in the landscape, carefully dismantling their old settlement and building a new one. And indeed, we can call that resilience. But in the medieval world, this was only feasible as long as village communities had strong communal property rights on large territories, in which they could choose where to settle and gradually relocate their houses. After 1300, there were very few places where this was still possible, as many coastal marshes had been enclosed and privatized. Henceforth, resilience had to be negotiated on a free property market on which the victims of flood did not have a lot of agency. Increasingly, so-called relocations were ordinary evictions, and the apparent resilience of the settlement was increasingly fake, a smokescreen upheld for strategic purposes, for instance claiming the old liberties and the resources of a long-vanished community. It's only by unraveling not only the environmental but also the social processes behind settlement relocation that we can distinguish resilience from vulnerability. Thank you.